Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mrs. Toops, and today we will begin our study of ecology. You should follow along in your notes beginning on page 3. The first thing we have to do is define what in the world is ecology. The word itself, eco, comes from a Greek word oikos that means home or house or dwelling. And so it stands to reason that the study of our home or our house or dwelling is the interactions that occur between all living things with each other, and also how these organisms or how living things interact with their physical environment. So in your notes, make sure that you've jotted down the definition of ecology at the top of page 3, which is the study of interactions of living organisms with one another and their physical environment. As we approach the study of ecology, there are some important terms that we need to define and get straight. Many of these, I believe, you'll already be very familiar with and very comfortable with. So let's start with the word habitat. We all think of some place where a living thing might reside or might live. And so the definition of a habitat, is exactly that. It is where an organism is going to live or reside. A species we looked at in our last unit, and we all agreed that the definition of a species are going to be organisms that are very similar, but the important thing is in order to be classified as a species is that organism has to be able to interbreed and produce fertile, viable offspring. And so the definition of the definition of species is organisms that with similar DNA or similar genes that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. The third vocabulary term that we need to identify is called niche. And this word is used to refer to the role of a species in its environment. In other words, what is its job? What is its primary responsibility within the environment, and how does it interact with all of the other living things and non-living things in its environment? That's called an organism's niche. The fourth term we've seen before as well. These are population refers to all of the individuals that are of the same species that live in the same area. Now that area can certainly change. It might be your backyard, it might be our classroom, it might be an entire ocean, but the reference to a population always refers to one particular species that live in the same place at the same time. All right, are we good? Let's go. Community is new. This is where we look at multiple populations that exist in the same area and how they live together. So a community is all the different populations that live in the same habitat. So in our classroom, we've talked about how there are humans in our classroom, there are bacteria in our classroom or prokaryotes, there are probably spiders, a few crickets, maybe even a mouse or two. But while those would represent different populations within a given area, altogether, all of those organisms are going to refer to the community in which they live. Finally, we come to the term ecosystems. And this word is used to describe all of the ecological systems, whether it's the living things, the non-living things, but it's a community and all of the factors that affect that community. A couple of examples that they give here are in a forest ecosystem. There would be deer, there would be rabbits, there would be the water sources, the trees, the plants, the shrubs, the rocks. All of these things are part of something broader than a community, but they include the non-living things. And this is the first kind of hierarchical term that we've encountered where the non-living things are considered as well. So we looked at, when we think about an organism, that's just one individual. When we think about a population, that's a population of the same species of individuals. A community represents all of the living things within a given area. And so the fourth level here, an ecosystem, finally incorporates those non-living aspects or abiotic factors within that habitat or within that particular region. So that begs the question, what in the world do we mean by abiotic factors? So three other terms that we want you to be familiar with is the word biotic and abiotic. Now, biotic you should know because you're sitting in a biology class, and you know that biology is the study of life, the study of living things. So a biotic factor in an ecological sense is any living thing, whether it be a plant, an animal, a bacteria, a single-celled organism. That would be considered a biotic factor or living factor. If we add the prefix a in front of that word, that means not. And so the term abiotic means not living. So anything that's part of the environment, whether it's the air that we breathe or the water that's available to plants, rocks, the temperature, the moisture in the air, all of these things are factors that interact with the biotic factors, but they are the non-living things. So biotic means living, abiotic is non-living. And finally, the term biodiversity. Well, we know what diversity means, but this is just referring to the diversity of living species within an ecosystem. Biomes like the rainforest are going to have a lot greater biodiversity. In other words, they're going to have a lot more varied species living within that region than, say, a desert, which is going to be very limited in its biodiversity because of limiting factors, because of that particular climate, and so forth. So different types of ecosystems are going to have different biodiversity, and it's all going to be tied to not only the biotic factors, but the abiotic factors as well. So at this point, we should have filled in all of our notes on page 3. I'll pause here, or this might be a good time for Mrs. Legacy to pause the video so that if anyone needs to fill in or if you miss something here on this page, you have a moment to do that. Okay, so now let's look at page 4 and talk about how energy flows between organisms within an ecosystem. Well, first of all, when we define energy, we know that we learned this when we studied photosynthesis, that all life and all energy on our planet starts with the sun. It is the ultimate source or the original source of all energy. The sun and the amount of light and sunlight that's available is going to dictate the type of organisms that can survive in a particular ecosystem and also the number of organisms that can survive in a particular ecosystem. And so when we look at the energy flow or how energy moves through the ecosystem, we always start with the sun. And if you think about yourself in this regard, well, how do we get energy? Well, we get energy by eating. And the foods that we eat either come from plants, which have the ability to convert solar energy into chemical energy, food, or we eat animals that have eaten plants that got that initial solar energy converted from a form that they could use into a form that is available for organisms like you and I to get energy. And so different organisms have different ways of getting this energy, but that we divide those up into different categories. The first one is what we call a producer. A producer is also known as an autotroph, T-R-O-P-H. A troph, or this word troph, let me see if I can get my pointer here to behave like a pen. This word right here, also Greek, and it means feeding or eating. And auto, in the biology sense, means self. So a producer is a self-feeder. They have the ability to take light, energy from the sun, and produce chemical energy in the form of carbohydrates specifically, but food. Bacteria can photosynthesize, by the way, this is photosynthesis. Plants and algae have the ability to convert light energy into chemical energy, and they do that through the process of photosynthesis. That's a producer. When we think about energy flow, it begins with the sun, but then it's captured at first in the form of producers. So plants are a very important part of our ecosystem. Consumers are going to be those organisms that do not have the ability to make their own food. So again, if we look at the word troph and know that that means feeding, hetero means different or other. And so these organisms must get their energy by eating other organisms. And so when they eat plants or they eat animals that eat plants, the consumer is able to obtain energy in this fashion. Now, when we look at producers, they're autotrophs, consumers are heterotrophs. And we're going to divide our consumers up into three broad categories. These are terms that you have probably seen and you probably know already, but it has to do with what type of organism is eaten by the consumer. For example, an herbivore is an organism that only eats plants. So these are plant eaters. Organisms like horses and rabbits and cows, these are herbivores. They get their primary energy from consuming plants. They don't eat meat. Carnivores are meat eaters. They obtain their energy from eating other types of animals. An example of this is a lion or a snake that consumes a mouse or a rat. These are carnivores. An omnivore, which is describing most of us, are organisms that eat plants and meat. And so humans are this way, bears are this way, but they are able to obtain energy from eating food, whether it be a plant-based food or an animal-based food. So you'll need to remember the definition of a producer, that it's an autotrophic organism, a consumer is a heterotrophic organism, and be able to differentiate between herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. Okay, the last vor in our list is what is called a detravore. Now, we will look at two terms that refer to how energy is moved from one organism to another. These terms are called the food chain and the food web. A food chain is tracking how energy is moving through an ecosystem from one organism to another. The arrows that you see in these diagrams go from how the energy is flowing. In other words, you can think of it as food going into the mouth of the organism that's into the point of the arrow. For example, the sun provides energy for the plants that you see in this diagram. These are known as our producers. The plants then provide energy into the mouth of this herbivore, which in this case is a caterpillar. The caterpillar then is eaten by a bird. So the caterpillar goes into the mouth of the bird and becomes the energy source for the bird. The bird would then could be consumed by a top predator or a tertiary consumer, a carnivore, and this carnivore would then get its energy from consuming this particular bird. Now, this is, again, a food chain. It's showing the pathway of energy through this ecosystem. The difference between a food chain and a food web is on the next page. If you look at a food web, this shows all of the possible food chains in an ecosystem. So it shows how these organisms are related. Each level, what we call level in the food web, is referred to as a trophic level. Now, we've looked at this a few minutes ago, and we determined, we've seen this before, an autotroph is an organism that makes its own food. A heterotroph is an organism that has to consume another in order to get energy. So trophic, again, is popping up here, and it means feeding. So these are levels or stages in a food chain that the energy passes through. And we call them trophic levels because they refer to the amount of food that's going from organism to organism. For example, the first trophic level is always going to be a producer. It's always going to be some sort of plant organism because they are the only ones that can typically capture energy from the sun and convert that into a chemical form. The second trophic level is called the primary consumer. The primary consumer is the organism that consumes the producer. Sometimes it's a quick way to write this is to abbreviate with a 1 and a little circle. It looks like a degree sign, but that is indicating the primary consumer. But notice it's the primary consumer, but it's on the second trophic level because the first trophic level is occupied by the producer. The third trophic level is what is called a secondary consumer. And as you might have guessed, we can abbreviate that with 2 and the little degree symbol. So a secondary consumer is an organism that eats either the carnivore at the second trophic level, or so it's either a carnivore or it could be an omnivore, an organism that eats both plants and animals. The fourth trophic level is called the tertiary. Now that may be a new word for you. We abbreviate this with a 3 and a little degree symbol because tertiary means 3. It's on the fourth trophic level, but it's the third tertiary consumer level. And this is going to usually be some sort of top carnivore, top predator at this particular level in a food web. If you look at the diagram that's given here in this picture, this is a more accurate representation of how energy is transferred. A food web gives more possibilities than just simply a food chain that's showing one chain of command. A food web is a combination of food chains. And so you can see down here at the bottom that phytoplankton would be considered a producer. One way to identify a producer is it's always providing energy to other organisms. In other words, this phytoplankton is always providing energy to the zooplankton and always providing energy to the krill. You never see an arrow coming into the phytoplankton. Why? Because they're autotrophs. They make their own food. And so that's one way to identify a producer in a food web like this. We can see that the krill then provide energy to the carnivorous plankton. These are organisms that get their energy by eating others. So they eat the krill, and they also eat the zooplankton that ate the phytoplankton, which is the plants. This becomes the energy source for some of the fish. But if you can see this, you can see that plankton are not the only food source for the fish. Fish can also get their energy from krill. They can get it from the zooplankton and from the carnivorous plankton. And so this goes on, and you can find top levels by just following the arrows in a particular diagram and seeing how these organisms obtain their energy by consuming others. And this is known as a food web. Okay, so last little topic here on page 6, and this did go pretty quickly, is what we call an energy pyramid. We've talked about energy and we've talked about food chains and food webs, and often ecologists will use a diagram that's in a pyramid form to represent the amount of energy that's contained and available to each trophic level. A very important number that you need to remember when you think about an energy pyramid is the number 10%. Okay? And that is because it is estimated that of all of the energy that is potentially available from all of these producers, only about 10% of that energy is transferred to the organism in the trophic level directly above it. So in this example, they're showing 10,000 usable energy units. In this case, the unit is kilocalories. So 10,000 calories are available from this producer level, but only 1,000 calories actually make it to the second level. Of that 1,000, only 10% of that, or 100 kilocalories, make it to the secondary consumer, and 10% of that make it to the third. And this is because when organisms consume other organisms, much of that potential energy is lost. It's lost as waste, and it's lost as heat. So while energy is one of those things that are conserved in nature, it can get converted, but much of it is lost. And so the energy pyramid is shaped the way that it is to represent that loss of energy that occurs between the various trophic levels. So in your notes, it has on the left the title Energy Pyramid, and it says a diagram showing the amount of energy contained in each trophic, remember that means feeding level. Only 10% of that energy is transferred to the organism that eats it, and most of it is lost as heat. And you might add a little note there too, that in parentheses you could put waste. So there's some waste products that are lost here as well. Okie doke, our last little topic on page 6 are some terms that you're probably very familiar with, and that is competition and predation, as well as symbiotic relationships. So we'll just review those. I believe this is something you guys learned in middle school, but I can't remember when. Okay, first of all, interactions are the relationships that occur between organisms. Many times organisms are going to compete for resources, whether it's food, water, space, or a mate. But this is the term competition. And the definition is where organisms attempt to use a resource in the same place at the same time. So again, that resource might be food, it might be a mate, it might be a habitat that they're competing for. But because there are limited resources, this results in a competitive situation. Contrast that with a predator-prey relationship. This is called a predation interaction. And this is where one organism, the predator, hunts and kills another, the prey, for food. In the example that you see here, this is a hawk who is the predator, and its prey is the rabbit. So these are types of interactions that can occur within ecological systems. One is pretty standard because it's setting up or it recognizes that there are limited resources and organisms will compete for those resources. And then finally, the predator-prey relationship is an example of where one organism has to hunt, capture, and kill another organism in order to obtain energy. And that's called the predator-prey. All right, last little topic, and we're almost done. And that is symbiotic relationships. Well, just to go back for just a second, not all interactions are competitive. Not all interactions are predator-prey. There's a gray area, if you will, and these are called symbiotic relationship. Sym means together, biotic means living, and so the definition of a symbiotic relationship is where you have two organisms that are living close together, and they have a special relationship. Most of the time, it is not fatal, a fatal type of relationship. Sometimes it can be, though. But let's just look at some of the examples of this. For example, the first type is called mutualism. Okay, mutualism is a type of relationship between two organisms where both of the organisms benefit from the relationship. The example in the picture here is a hummingbird and a flower. Well, the hummingbird is getting food from the flower. What does the flower get? It gets a pollinator. So the pollen or the sperm from the flower sticks to the hummingbird, and when the hummingbird goes and feeds on other flowers, it's passing that sperm or that pollen on to another flower. So they're both benefited by this relationship, and it's called a mutualistic or mutualism symbiotic relationship. The second type of relationship is called commensalism. And in this example, one organism benefits while the other is not helped or harmed. So in this relationship, one organism gains something from this. The other is neither helped, but he's not harmed either. The third type of relationship is called a parasite or parasitism. And most of the time we associate this with something negative. This is where one organism feeds off of another organism, whereby the organism that's feeding is helped by the relationship, but the organisms that's the meal in this case, they're harmed. It's usually not fatal, but it certainly can be, and it can maybe cause disease, or the organism loses body tissue or something like that. An example of this is a tick. Ticks also carry diseases, so sometimes those things can be pretty nasty. But basically, the tick is biting into its victim and sucking blood and getting nutrients from the blood of its victim. And the victim will sometimes experience irritation at that site of the bite. They lose a little bit of blood from it. Sometimes they'll pass along an infection or a virus or bacteria that can cause a more serious infection, but that is known as a parasite. And those are the three types of symbiotic relationships that we need to cover today. Okay, so that wraps up our notes for now. You are going to do some classwork to practice some of these concepts today, and you'll want to make sure that you review all of your notes tonight. Make sure you're very comfortable with the terminology, so you'll be prepared when I'm back next week to continue our lessons on ecology. Thank you and have a great day.